I don't blame Cujo at all. I have the exact same reaction to people who are unnecessarily loud. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. As per my 2020 13 Nights of Halloween series, today I'm going to be talking about the 1983 natural horror film, Cujo. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Cujo stars Dee Wallace, Danny Pintauro, and Daniel Hugh-Kelly, and was directed by Teague. Based on Stephen King's 1981 novel of the same name, it tells the story of Donna Trenton, played by Dee Wallace, who finds herself trapped in a car with her young son facing the threat of a rabid St. Bernard. Cujo was the start of things for me. This was the first Stephen King book I ever read. I was 13 years old, and I can still remember reading it during our silent reading period in school and kind of glancing around, feeling like I was going to get in trouble for reading some of the stuff I was reading in school. Not long after finishing the book, I watched the movie for the first time. And while it technically wasn't my first Stephen King movie, it was the first one that I knowingly sat down to watch in its entirety, and it kicked off my several-year perpetual cycle of reading Stephen King books and immediately following them up with watching the film adaptation. Cujo is one of those Stephen King stories that everybody's aware of. Even if you've never read the book or seen the movie, just the name Cujo conjures the image of a rabid St. Bernard. And so this story often gets reduced to being the one about the dog, and it certainly is about Cujo, but there's a lot more nuance to the story than your typical when animals attack movie. This is a very character-driven story, and nearly the first half of this movie is devoted to setup and character development. This is a dark family drama that just so happens to evolve into a natural horror story. Everybody thinks of or remembers the dog attack, and while it's certainly the most exciting aspect of this movie, it's only a small component of the whole. It's a story about fear, about motherhood and common domestic issues, and about putting things into perspective. And without those themes and the time spent establishing and developing the main characters, the iconic Cujo scenes wouldn't have been nearly as impactful or memorable. Despite its thematic layers, Cujo's a deceptively simple story, and that's a huge part of why it works so well. There's nothing supernatural going on here. You've got an extremely small cast of characters who feel like believable real people, and you've got an unfortunate situation that feels equally as believable. Yeah, a lot of individual things had to go wrong for it to happen, but it still feels like something that could happen. And so the film benefits from that, because it's really easy to put yourself in that situation, which makes it far scarier than it otherwise would have been. But that realism is key here. Once the horror situation's in place, we're dealing with a single location confined space story. We've got a mother and a very young kid trapped in basically a race against time with no clear way out and nobody coming to help them. The movie certainly has its moments of blood and gore and just general grossness, but it's mostly tense. The suspense is what makes it scary. There's the looming threat of Cujo, but it's not like he's constantly attacking. He's frequently just an ominous presence, and there are many moments in this film where we don't even know exactly where he is. So that creates this further tension. And on top of all that, we've got the issue of our two characters being trapped in a hot car in the middle of the summer for several days with no water. So dehydration and heat stroke become just as much of a threat as the rabid dog outside. The scenario certainly lends itself to being scary, but like I said before, this movie wouldn't have been nearly as effective if it weren't for the characters. The time spent setting them up was important, but the performances were the essential key to it all. And both Dee Wallace and Danny Pintauro as Donna and Tad Trenton were fantastic. This movie needed that believability, and these two deliver it. Wallace gives an emotional and exhaustingly real performance as the mother who's willing to do absolutely anything to protect her son. And Pintauro, who was only 6 years old at the time of filming, delivers one of the most impactful child performances in any horror movie. It's an absolutely draining experience watching and listening to him, but it's so real. It's exactly what you'd expect of a 6-year-old in this situation, and it just makes the whole thing that much more visceral and unsettling. Dee Wallace and Danny Pintauro might be billed as the stars of this movie, but the true star is Cujo, or more accurately, Mo the dog, several other stunt dogs, an animatronic puppet, and stuntman Gary Morgan in a dog costume. But really, Cujo's so central to this movie for obvious reasons. The makeup and action and stunt work revolving around Cujo is phenomenal here, and as scary and intimidating as he is in this story, I love how the book and movie both make it clear that he's not a monster. He's just a sick dog. In the book, part of the story is written from Cujo's perspective, and we understand his pain and confusion through his inner monologue. In the movie, we get a sense of the same thing. After his infection, we see his gradual physical decline. We see his pain and discomfort at sounds that never used to bother him, and his sadness and confusion in his final moments as himself out in the fog. And it's so conflicting, because you truly feel bad for Cujo. He really was a good dog. As much as I like this movie, there's one major issue that I have with it, and it's the change to the ending. Now, I'm gonna keep this spoiler-free, so I'm gonna be vague here, but this has been something that's always bothered me about this movie ever since the very first time I watched it. Changes are inevitable when you're talking about the film adaptation of a book. You can never put all of a novel's details into a normal-length film. I'm totally fine with minor changes and condensation of material as part of this conversion process, but it bothers me when major plot points get changed or the tone is significantly altered. And that's exactly what happens here with this ending, and it nearly wrecks this one for me. Now, I get why they made the change for the movie, and I know that Stephen King was supportive of it and has even said that the book's ending is one of his biggest writing regrets, but that ending was much more in line with the rest of the story and far, far, far more impactful than what we get in the movie. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one is the tension. The scenario itself is very suspenseful, but then you throw in characters who we've actually been given enough time to care about, and so that tension builds even more. Then you've got an unpredictable and frequently unseen antagonist, and it builds some more. Even the cinematography adds to this tension. We're often put into Cujo's paws and see scenes play out from his point of view. But sometimes we're misled by the camera. We're made to believe we're viewing a scene from one character's perspective, only to startlingly find out that we're not. It all works to heighten the suspense of an already edge-of-your-seat scenario, and results in an extremely anxiety-inducing movie. The second pro is Cujo. From a character perspective, he's one of the most, if not the most, sympathetic of Stephen King's villains. Everybody thinks of him as this bloodthirsty monster, but he's really just a sick dog who isn't in control of himself anymore. So you truly feel bad for him, even though you don't want him to succeed in his siege on the car. And from a production standpoint, Cujo's really impressive in this movie. The vast majority of Cujo shots were filmed using one of a team of trained St. Bernards, and they do a great job with their scenes and look so grody with the makeup. On the con side, I only have one major issue with this movie, and it's the ending. Again, spoiler-free, so I won't say what happens, but it nearly ruins this movie for me. I know this might just sound like an "oh, they changed the book" complaint, but it's more than just any change. This is a huge change that completely alters the tone and messaging of this movie. I mean, the change makes sense in terms of box office success for the film, but it's so out of line with the rest of the story, and has just always been extremely disappointing to me. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Cujo or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Cujo 3.5 out of 5 paws. This is such a simple but tense and effective horror movie that does a great job of establishing really believable characters. I certainly have a degree of nostalgia for this one given my history with Cujo, but even so, the change to the ending of the story and the resulting tonal discrepancy really dragged this one down for me. I would recommend Cujo to people who want a solid, contained Stephen King horror story without any of the supernatural elements that we tend to see in his movies. If you appreciate horror movies that set up their characters before the action gets going, then this will be a good one for you. And if you're a fan of when animals attack type movies, then you'll especially enjoy the second half of this movie. If you liked Cujo, I would recommend Pet Sematary. It's another animal-centric Stephen King movie, but also has darkly heavy themes revolving around a parent-child relationship. If you want another tense, single-location, confined space thriller, you should watch Panic Room. It's a severely underrated David Fincher film, and also features a mother and child trapped with both a ticking clock and no help on the way. And if you just love the Cujo scenes and want to watch some more crazy canine carnage, you might want to check out the aptly named Dogs. It's an unusual but chaotic B-movie centered around pet dogs suddenly turning vicious and laying siege to an entire town. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Cujo? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie featuring an animal attack? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.